Hey guys, got an update on my game Saturn 7. So what happens is every time you exit out from the wherever you are playing the game, it saves a screenshot so that when you resume, it picks up from where you left off. So there's that. There's a little bit of a jump there. I'll try and fix that up. But so basically, as it's loading in, it's already got a screenshot of where you're going to continue on. At least that's the idea. Yeah, so I've spent enough time on this level already. I'm very keen to move on, but I've laboured long and hard on it because I had to consolidate all my code into one big file because it makes the programming so much easier. So now I've got almost 3,000 lines of code in my character controller, and which is about 80 to 85, maybe closer to 90% of all the code in the game already in that one big behavior. And how I've got it is I've got each code running at different speeds, of course, for optimal performance. So in other words, I've got all sorts of different timings of the code to run that I don't run anything needs to be run faster than it needs to be. In other words, it seems to help a little bit with performance. That's working just fine. So for example, this one here, all it is just looks up, gets the current time. Is the current time greater than your last update of that variable? If so, then update it again and then run the code. It's pretty straightforward. Now, one problem I've had in getting the code from the copy cube, very often transitioning it from default drop-down menu items and do later, the drop-down after so many milliseconds do this. It makes the code in CopyCube fairly easy just to organize it in that way, but you can't really code that same way as easily if you're doing it inline JavaScript, because it wants to run the whole lot in that one frame. So you can run an action, and that action will set up an on-frame loop separate to your main code, sure, temporarily, so that you can unregister it later on when you don't need it. That's fine, but the code that you want to run after that time delay has to be held within that function. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It doesn't go away, do a time loop, then come back and run the code. It doesn't work that way. It'll go away, set up the time loop, and let that run, and then but then it will come back and want in that same frame, not after so many milliseconds, but that same frame it'll come back and just continue running your code. So you won't actually get that time delay thing to work if you're doing inline JavaScript unless you do sort of a different type of thing. This is how I've set it up. It's not as clean, but it does work. Okay, here's some examples of different code that I need to do a time delay on before I run something inline JavaScript. So instead of pulling it out of CopyCube and putting it into this one big behavior, I still want certain things to run after a certain amount of time. So in other words, I'll need, say for example, a new variable name, and then that variable name will contain an amount. And if it's more than 0, then it will look for is the current time greater than that time, then it will run the code. In other words, like this will just turn the lightning off, in other words. So in other words, I've consolidated potentially two variables into one. So once this code is run, it resets the variable back to 0 and then doesn't need to run anymore. So it's like a one-off run, only when it's updated, not equal to 0. But that also means it's checking every single time if this variable is greater than 0, which is not a big deal. It's not every frame. This particular code only runs every 100 milliseconds. So that's really not too bad. It's fine. There's no performance really loss in doing that at all, I would say. But that's one way you'd get around it. I've seen other people post some stuff about some fairly complex setting up arrays of functions and all this sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, you can get complex like that if you want. I've just tried to keep it simple. So this is how I do time delays in online JavaScript. So, and that seems to work pretty well. So It's a bit foggy here. Now you can see my set up these little light shafts. Yeah, so it's a nice little thing that I've just worked out. If you get the transparency and the color right, you don't need to do anything. You just drop it underneath the light, and the light itself will determine how bright that light shaft gets according to the intensity of the light itself, which is, for me, it's determined by the code, and in this case it's the battery percentage. So I've just added them for those three. I hope it's not too severe, but anyway, for now that's just a little thing I've been playing with. If I was to fast forward that, as the light gets brighter, that intensity of that light shaft will get stronger. I suppose arguably it's a little bit too strong at the moment because the light is not very, it's only at 15%, so I guess that probably is a bit too strong actually. Anyway, so as you can see, the main idea for this was to show the frame rate. Actually, my standard frame rate is 220 frames per second. Now I've noticed it's about 150 now, but I guess that's because the screen recording software is probably the reason for that. But yeah, that's not normally the case. So in other words, you can still get very high frame rate in CopperCube, and even add some cool stuff. Yeah. So I've just been playing with a bit of glow effect here as well. I don't think I'll keep that glow effect. A bit quieter, because I don't think you need it. Because those light switches just stay on all the time. A bit quieter in here. It's a bit better. Yeah, I've made a lot of changes to this code in the game, improved it so much, and for me it's necessary because I'm creating lots of separate levels, and what I don't want to be doing is constantly going back and editing old files and upgrading it with new code that I've upgraded in other files since it was made, and constantly going in circles like that all the time. It's an absolute disaster. That's one of the reasons why I put all my code into one big behavior like this. It's a massive amount of code, but yeah, it's running pretty good. 220 frames per second was consistently the average. It seems to be this recording software drops the frame rate a bit. Yeah, but anyway, but even still with that, still get about 150. That's I guess it's something, but yeah, anyway. So the actual frame rate's not going to really show on this video, but you have to take my word for it. Yeah, so that's, for me, it's been really important to get everything working as much as possible and pull as much code out of CopperCube CCB files into this behavior as much as possible, such that all I need to do when upgrading new levels or adding new code to the big behavior, which I'll do a lot in the future, no doubt about it, is go back to this level in the future and just refresh plugins and actions and behaviors, and then save it, and it's updated, boom, without hardly any more changes needed. So that's the benefit of putting it into a behavior. It's just so much easier to update the game. Yeah. Don't worry about the terrain out there. That's very blurry, but I'll fix that up. That's one of the last things I have to do to fix up. Now, in terms of some optimizations, okay, so for example, I've got some clothing, headgear. I haven't done headgear yet. You know, we got gloves and stuff, shoes. There's a bit of work to be done on the clothing department, but it's sort of getting there. I can add the shoes in, and you know, typical stuff like that. Jackets, gloves. Just need to upgrade some of the sounds and so forth. But really, one of the things I wanted to really show in this video was some coding optimizations, actually. Okay, so here's some code one thing you might not be aware of, when you're doing for loops over an array of information to check for whatever distance or whatever it is, you actually don't need to store the name of the object. You can just store the actual node in the array directly, which is interesting. So what I was doing before was, get a list of items and then store it all into an array, and then get that array and filter it through in another section of the game and just pick out the local items of that array from the name of the item. So then so in other words, you get the node, get the name, put it into the array, get the name of the item out of the array, get the node from the name, and then work with it that way. But that's double counting a bit of work there. You don't need to do that. You can actually just put into the array the nodes directly without getting the name at all. So that's actually a little bit more efficient. So in other words, this array here, interactables, it's actually adding in the actual the node. So that get child C node. It's actually adding the node into the array. It's not. It's using a name here just for a separate check, but and when I use that array in the game, it's just a bit more efficient. You can for loop over the nodes, so you already got the nodes in the array already, so you don't need to go looking up the nodes each and every time. So there's one little optimization. Yeah, and I mentioned the other one already, that you can run the code in different sections and different speeds. Helps with the performance a little bit on the CPU as well. Well, helps quite a bit actually. And you can put all of that in the one big behavior. So if anyone's making a considerable size game and they're having more than one CCB file that you're going to load in different sections, I highly recommend you do it this way. You put all your code into one big behavior and you run it at different sections at different speeds for optimal performance. So, and the actual speed of your game will be identical as if you had all the code in those little JavaScript boxes within CopperCube. There's no difference in speed. I've checked; it's exactly the same. But this will be way better bug finding, for checking for duplicated variable names, you name it, copying and pasting, moving code around, anything and everything. And this will be a much better way than using the JavaScript boxes in CopperCube. I don't recommend anyone use that method unless you're just creating a single exe file. Then I guess it doesn't really matter. But even then, if you're making a big enough game and you're getting a lot of bugs, it's going to be a lot easier if you do it this way, because about half the time, or more than half the time, it gives you the line number of where the problem's located, but it won't tell you what the problem is. So if you've got one big behavior with all your code in it, there's only one place you need to go to. Whereas before, I was using literally, 50 different blocks of code in the JavaScript boxes all over the place, and debugging was an absolute nightmare. I've got to say, it was absolutely terrible. It's way better now. Doing it this way, my productivity is probably more than twice as fast. I can update the game, make improvements, bug find, fix it up and get it running. You can drop the whole code in an online validator. If there's some sort of syntax error, you can drop the whole code in there and it'll check the whole thing. It's quite easy actually, it's quite good. You can't do that when you've got code in little JavaScript boxes everywhere. Well, you can, but it's a real pain to work with. It's extremely painful. So I don't recommend you do that. Unless, of course, like I said, you're making a single exe file with all your game in that one exe file, and you're not using many JavaScript boxes anyway, then it's probably fine. Okay, here's another thing. It's just a small improvement. When you're setting up global variables, instead of having a whole big long list of var, this equals 0 or whatever is some default number or text, it's just a lot cleaner to put it into like an array format. So you have one array equals another array with var in front of it, and what it will do, initialize all these variables, and it will initialize to equal what the appropriate variable at the same index of the other array is located at. It's quite an quick and easy way to put all your variables that way as well. Okay, here's the game. Here's a nice little trick you might like, you might not. Having a ton of arrays works, it's fine, but it's problematic if you need to go back and you constantly make improvements, adjustments and tweaks all the time. It can be a real pain because typically that array of data is not located somewhere easily accessible, or you might, you've got to get the exact index of the right thing that you need to update exactly right. So I have a high tendency, I tried it that way in the beginning, and I was constantly going backwards and forwards to the array and editing it and changing it and testing it, and it wasn't seem to be the optimal way. So in some cases I've used the actual name of the object to hold the type of data that I need to check. So for example, this tells me what type of object it is, tells me the sound to play, tells me the positive or negative or with axis to move the door, tells me which level, tells me what type of information. This is a storage container actually, and this is the weather exposure, 40%. So my game uses all that information to do a whole stack of things with it. I find it just easier in some cases to put quite a bit of information into the name. It's not, you can do it how you like, but that's one way I found it to be easier. You can just simply edit it on the fly and then run it. Boom! There's no need to go back to find the array, find the index, find the right thing you need to update and change the number. You can just do it straight away like that. It's so easy. Yeah, and you just use a substring. You can just pick out the information that you need using substrings. It's pretty easy. Here's the setup of the light shafts. Potentially a little bit too bright because it doesn't dim enough when it's low power. I'll have to look at that. I'm not even sure I'll eventually use that, because if I use a torch, the player has a torch and there's no light coming out from these roof lights, and it'll probably highlight this. This is just a cone. That's all it is, with a special texture on it. It'll probably highlight these cones, so that wouldn't make much sense to do that. So I may not eventually keep that, but it was just an interesting idea try it out. Yeah, I probably won't use the glow either. That's just a 2D, a 3D plane mesh with a texture on it. I've tried using bloom in CopyCube, but I just haven't been able to use it because the outdoor sky brightness is always pretty much brighter than anything in the spaceship. So if I wanted to bloom all the light switches, it makes the outdoor environment like some ghostly, really weird sort of glow effect on the outdoor environment. It doesn't look right. So, and not only that, it hits the frame rate takes about 20 frames per second off my frame rate. I was getting 220 without bloom, and then putting bloom on it was down to 200 frames a second, so not really the ideal in terms of performance either. And in any case, it's not even as good as doing your own little glow effect like that. That looks way better than the CopyCube bloom anyway, post-processing. So yeah, probably won't be using bloom at all in my game. Okay, another trick I've used to optimize loading times and also the size of all the files on the disk, it's getting quite large, is what I was realizing. I was loading a whole stack of textures that I didn't really need to load straight away. I could load on demand and it wouldn't affect the game at all. So I was originally that level was 120 megabytes, and by just not loading a whole stack of textures from the get-go that I didn't need to, I was able to get it down to about 65, or eventually under 60 megabytes. So about half. I got the size down considerably because a lot of the textures I just didn't need to load straight away. A lot of the items, when you're in the inventory and you right click to drop it on the ground, for example, that will then load the texture to apply to that mesh as you need it. Because you're only dropping one item at a time, the time it takes to load that texture and apply it to that mesh is not noticeable at all, actually, I've realized. Even, strangely enough, 2K textures load pretty quick and applied to the object on demand, so I didn't need to load those into the game at all. And so when you're playing the game, you may not even use that. You might not drop stuff on the ground during that particular level that you've just loaded, so there's no point loading all those textures in. So that's another optimization I've got in the game. Okay, another little optimization I've got here is now not the textures this time, but the actual mesh. There's a lot of my items that have the same base mesh, but just different texture, like access cards and soft drinks. They all use the same soda bottle mesh. So I've just created a little check here to see. I have an array of information just containing that bit of information where it's a shared mesh, and what it does is, if that's the case, it just uses that shared mesh as the base and applies the appropriate texture for that particular item. So in other words, you don't need to be loading it like a separate mesh and a separate texture for every single item you're going to be dropping in the ground. It's a bit more optimal not to do it that way and have just shared items as much as possible. And in some cases, in certain clothing items I drop on the ground, it actually doesn't load any texture because it uses the UI texture. Yeah, it'll actually work alright if you. In some cases, I've got it in such a way that it will show up pretty decent on a basic, very simple mesh by using the UI textures that are already part of the game anyway. So in other words, I'm double using some of the textures. So that's another little optimization. There's plenty of things like that if you put your mind to it. Yeah, so I hope you like my little update, and I'm very keen to get out of this level and onto a new level because I've spent so much time on this one, much more than I really wanted to, but I had to spend a ton of time. It's literally taken me months to pull the code out of CopyCube and transition it to work correctly into one big inline JavaScript code. Yeah, so it's taken ages, but it's totally worth it. It would have been way better had I just from the beginning done it that way. So anyone new starting a game in CopyCube and using JavaScript, if it's a considerable size game that they're thinking of making, I highly recommend you do it the way I was showing you with one big behavior and just run things at different sections at different speeds. Don't use the boxes of JavaScript code in CopyCube. It's very difficult for bug fixing, I can tell you that. Yeah, so I hope you like a couple of updates there. My game has been tweaked quite a bit. It's a lot more, things are working a lot better at the moment. There's always going to be improvements, but yeah, so I've taken almost all the code out of CopyCube and put it into the behavior, so it's so much of a better method. And I had to go through all my code and update the delta time as well on pretty much anything that moves, opens, closes, or moves, had any sort of speed connected to it. I had to adjust the work a way out to give everything a bit of a delta time so that it runs smoothly no matter what the frame rate is. So that's yeah, it's working pretty good. So that's just a quick overview of some enhancements, I would say, to CopyCube. Anyway, so there is I can't remember if I was showing you this level or not, but anyway, yeah. So there's a ton of different upgrades there. The only thing left for me to do now is just to upgrade the outdoor texture to the proper size resolution. That's only 512 by 512 resolution. So everything in the game by default, it has textures loaded by default at about 512 by 512 resolution. That's just for me, so that when I go and open the level and want to edit something, I can actually see what I'm doing. That's the only reason. Otherwise, I would have removed all the textures and just have it load according to the level of detail that you want to load when the game starts up. That already happens automatically anyway, and it overrides all the 512 by 512 textures. But because they're such small in size, loading them as well as any other textures like 1 or 2K or the 4K textures, it doesn't really make any difference. So I've left the basic 512. Even with the 512, it doesn't look terrible. I mean, it's not great, but yeah, but you can see the outlines of everything just perfectly fine. Anyway, so that's why I've done that. Yeah, so I have three levels. On each of my level would be 1K textures, 2K textures, or 4K textures. So and all of them just works just fine. Just the 4K ones just take a bit longer to load. That's about the only difference. Yeah, so I hope you like just a quick update, and I'll be showing you my next spaceship in the next video, hopefully. Yeah, cheers.